So this parable comes right after the parable of the prodigal son, or the crazy loving father, as I think it should be called. And in that parable, we have a son who has gone off the rails, and then in the middle of it, he comes to his senses, and he comes home. Right? That's what we remember from that parable. This parable is a little bit, I think, at least part of the setup is the same. So you have this guy, this manager, who has risen to the point where he is in charge of a wealthy man's estate. So I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. One assumption is that this guy started out hardworking and trustworthy. Because I don't think he ever would have become the manager of this wealthy man's estate if he wasn't trustworthy and hard-working. So, now, though, he has become something. He's wasting his master's possessions. And it could be one or two or a combination of the two. He could either be lazy. He's just not going out and looking for those investment opportunities that he used to or whatever like that. It's just not... He's not pushing on it like he used to. Or he's become self-indulgent. And he's beginning to go to the nicer restaurants on his master's Visa card and all those kind of things that you might do. So lazy and or self-indulgent. Then he comes to his senses. But I want to stop here for a moment because what happened to him, I think, can happen to any of us. He became successful, and then he lost his way. Things were going well for him, and he kind of lost his anchor. Whatever hard work and integrity that he had practiced that brought him to the head of his master's estate, he had somehow lost that as the focus of his work, and he had become a wasteful manager. And so what I want to do, and I'm going to get to the end of this, Brian, hopefully, the understanding the whole parable, but what I want to do for a moment is just stop and think about the dangers of success, the dangers of having plenty. Most of us in this room have plenty, or kind of plenty. I mean, a lot of us in this room think, well, they've got plenty, but I almost have plenty. And it kind of doesn't matter where you are on the scale. Most people on the scale think, well, I'm okay, but they have plenty. And then these people think, I'm okay, but they have plenty. But regardless, on the world scale, we all have plenty. We are all in kind of that zone. And so, but being in that zone, being in a place of relative comfort and safety, brings with it its own dangers. And this manager experienced some of those, the spiritual dangers, in letting whatever had brought him to the head of the estate, in letting those slide. He experienced that spiritual danger that goes with success. So I picked up 6. I think 6 is an appropriate number for danger, right? Because that's Satan's number. So I picked up 6 dangers that go with success. And the first one is arrogance or smugness or pride. Sometimes if things are going well, you sort of develop this sort of smugness, a superiority. We start to think of ourselves as in a different class than other people. And the pride leads to some other things that we're going to get to in a minute, but that's a danger for us as people, both in terms of the world and the way we live our lives, and it's a spiritual danger too, to begin to get that sort of arrogance or smugness or pride. Solomon, the wise man, the wisest man that ever lived, Solomon wrote this about pride. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And so if you are in a place where you're having success, and it could be success, it could be like material success, it could be like success in some sort of habit. Maybe you've been trying to get fit, and you're getting success, and you're really starting to nail it. And that's a place where pride can creep in. Whatever it is you're trying to do, when you do it, one of the dangers that comes with success is pride. Another one that's a little different, and possibly what this manager fell into, is complacency. This complacency, I think I'm pretty good finished up. I did. complacency is a feeling of uncritical or smug satisfaction with oneself or one's achievements. So you're just kind of resting, right? You're done. You don't have to think or try or worry or engage anymore. You can just float. And that's not to say there aren't times of rest. Of course there are times of rest. God put a time of rest in our week when he said, don't work one day a week. In fact, he said, you better not work one day a week. In fact, he said to the Old Testament people when he was setting up the pattern, there was a punishment for work. And so this isn't about not taking a break from work. This is about just like deciding, well, I'm kind of done and sliding out. So a prophet we don't get to hear from too much, Zephaniah, wrote this to the people of Israel. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are complacent, those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. The Israelites had gotten complacent in that they sort of like, they were just resting on their laurels. They just didn't really care. They didn't think God was involved in their life anymore. And Zephaniah reminds them that you're skating along as though God's not going to come, that there's going to be no recompense for the evil you're doing and stuff like that. That's going to come back to bite you in the end. So arrogance or pride. Complacency, the third one, is also a possibility of what was going on with this manager, is self-indulgence. That when you reach a point of success, there is the danger of self-indulgence or selfishness. And James writes about this, but he sounds like an Old Testament prophet. He's got, I'm going to read a larger piece, and this is just the kind of the main piece there. This is James 5, 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, and weep and howl for the miseries that are coming on you. Definitely sounds like an Old Testament prophet. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, those are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. This is a danger of success. It certainly is a danger of wealth. That's not to say that wealthy people are all self-indulgent, but it's something that each of us need to think about and be aware. What am I doing with my time? What am I doing with my financial resources? What am I doing with all the stuff that's within my sphere of control? Am I using it all for myself? Or is it at God's disposal? That's what tithing is really supposed to do. It's not supposed to be like a law where you give God 10% and then you can go below the 90% on whatever you want. That's why in the New Testament there's no tithing rule. People do tithe because it's a good habit to remind us that all of our material possessions ultimately are at God's disposal. That's what tithing is supposed to do, is remind us, really, that all that we have is now dedicated to God because of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. God gave his all for us in Jesus, and so now we give our all for God. And Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to get through an eye of an needle. And that's because when you have a lot of material possessions, it can be very easy to become self-indulgent. Another thing that can happen to people when they get successful is they're no longer willing to listen to other people. They get sort of in this, it kind of goes along with that pride and arrogance mode, where we kind of start to feel like we know better than anybody, and we're kind of all that, and they should be listening to us, we shouldn't be listening to them. And to a certain extent, if you manage to succeed, that might even be true. But the attitude of closing off your ears to what other people say can bleed over also into closing off your ears to what God says about your life and how to live it as his follower. Jeremiah wrote this: "If you will not listen, my soul will weep in secret for your pride. My eyes will weep bitterly and run down with tears because the Lord's flock has been taken captive." When you get to where you're unwilling to listen to other people, you are captive to the pride that's inside of you. You are captive to the ideas that are insulating you from the outside influence of other people. And so this is a danger of success, as you become no longer willing to listen. Another danger of success, we've got two more here. One is that as you move up, there is a danger that you will begin to lead from a sense of authority and power. And Jesus says that his leaders don't lead like that. His leaders don't lord it over other people. A familiar verse for most of you here, Mark 10, 42 to 45. Jesus called his disciples together and said to them, "You know, those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so what happens when you work hard to get success? Well, you've got your success, and you're the man, you're the woman. And this is true. This is true in organizations, not just in the church. My dad was a dentist, and he was. I don't know how you define a successful dentist. I mean, he seemed to be, but what do I know? But what I do know is this: he hired a consultant to help him raise the profits from his dental practice. And my dad's idea was basically, it was the way they trained him in dental school too, is that you're like the god of the office, right? I mean, that's the way doctors are too. They're like the god of the office. They're the god of the hallway or whatever. At least that's the way they're trained sometimes. Less so than they used to be, thank goodness. So it's his practice, and he hires people, and his idea of management was, well, if I didn't say anything, you must have done a good job, so you should feel good about yourself. That's not so good. But where I'm going is that one of the things that the guy said, his consultant said, is that if you want to raise the level of your practice, you need to give your staff a piece of the action. And he's like, I'm a dentist. You want profit sharing for the share side? And he's like, yes. Because they need to know that you're a team. They need to know that you're all in this together. They're not going to work hard. They're not going to work hard on the hopes that you feel nice at the end of the year and give them a bonus. They want something locked down and hard and concrete to work for. They want to know that you're tying your destiny into them as much as they're tying their destiny into you. And that's a servant thing. And guess what? It worked. Because the whole team is what makes the experience in a dentist office. And it worked. His practice grew from that. And that is saying, I'm not the king of the office. I'm a servant leader, and we're all in this together. And that's what Jesus says here, in the bigger sense, of course, is that that the idea that when we make it, then we can sort of look down on all the other people. That is exactly not the way a servant, a leader, a powerful person uses their authority in the kingdom of God. They use it to serve. And the last one is the biggest spiritual danger, and it kind of grows out of all these other dangers, is a reduced sense of dependence on God. When you succeed, you have actually stepped into a dangerous area because your sense of needing God can diminish. There's a prayer that says, somebody else probably knows this prayer better than me. It's like, Lord, make me neither poor so I steal, or rich so that I forget you, but give me what I need from day to day. That's a pretty good prayer, I think. So this idea of never forgetting your dependence on God. God knew that the Israelites would face this when they got into the promised land, the land of milk and honey. They were headed into the land of promise is the danger zone for them. And he warned them about it. In Deuteronomy, he said, take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's what the Passover is all about. They had the biggest festival of the year is so you don't forget your dependence on God and what he has done for you. That's part of what the Lord's Supper does for us every week. When we come forward humbly, we remember what Jesus did for us and how we would be lost without God's mercy. We'd be lost without God's mercy. So the Holy Communion is a time for that remembered dependence on God. So those are 6 dangers that come with success. And this guy evidently fell into 1 or 2. He became either lazy or self-indulgent at least. But he was a bad manager, to be sure. And then what do? What happens in the parable? And I think this is kind of... I sure appreciate the honesty of your prayer, Brian, because if you put 10 theologians in a room, you'll get 11 opinions on this parable anyways. That is true. But what I think is what I told the kids. I think the master commended his servant because he began thinking about the future. I think he commended him because he realized he was in a bad place. He was in a pickle, and instead of it says he'd been wasting his possessions. He'd been just floating along. And I think his master might have commended him because now, for the first time, he thinks, okay, what am I going to do? And he begins to strategize. And it's hard for us to understand because he seems to be strategizing about how to cheat his master out of stuff. But let me tell you something about the way management worked back then. It was a lot more fluid. Several different occupations the profit of the occupation had to do with how much you could get. This is one of the reasons why tax collectors were so hated, is because the tax collector had to pay a certain amount of tax to the government. And then whatever was left over was what he got to keep. So you can imagine a tax collector going around and he gets a little complement of soldiers. He's the guy who pays, he collects the taxes, and he's got 5 Roman soldiers behind him, and he says, you owe me your taxes. And he kind of looks around the house, and then he says, no, a little more. Because he knows how much he has to pay the Romans, and then whatever the difference is between what he can collect and what he has to pay is his. So if you have a rich tax collector, it's because they've managed to pad that difference way up. And it's quite possible that the management of this estate worked exactly the same way. Is that the manager would get to keep, his pay would come in a portion of the proceeds of these things. And so it's possible, this is one explanation, is that he is giving up his profit sharing on these ventures. And so he's not stealing from his master when he says, go sit down and make it lower. He's giving up his profit sharing on there. So he's making friends by giving up his profit sharing. And now these people will, on one hand, they might be thankful to him because he lowered their debt. On the other hand, they might feel obligated to help him out because he helped them out, right? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So there are ways in which this is not quite so dastardly as it seems. But either way, the thing we do see is that he stopped being wasteful. I mean, he began to think ahead. And I don't know that that's entirely satisfying because right here it says the master commended his dishonest manager for his shrewdness. So I'm not sure that explanation holds water. So I just wasted 5 minutes of time. But I did read that from a commentator. I did not make that up. So it could still be true. Then Jesus says, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in little is dishonest in much. So what he tells us here as he moves on is that we need to not be like a wasteful manager. We need to be keeping account of what we do, and everything's important. The little stuff is important because it's the little stuff that leads to the big stuff. And of course, the final bam point is you can't serve two masters, God and money. But I want to go back to the idea that the manager quit wasting all of his time and began to think differently. For me, that's one of the places I can grab that I can understand this and say, well, that's something I can learn from this. So I would like to just kind of close by offering you a chance to reflect on whether or not any of these kind of things have crept into your life. And they can creep into your life not just on account of financial success or anything like that. You can get you can be arrogant or smug as a defense mechanism for failure. I know there is a certain, if you're in pastoral circles, sometimes you run across pastors of small churches who have a certain smugness about them because they're not giving into the pressures of the corporate church. So you can have a smugness about the smallness as well as you can have a smugness about the bigness. You could have a smugness about your lack of success as a defense mechanism. You can get complacent. You don't have to be successful to get complacent. You could be unsuccessful and still be lazy and complacent. So these don't all necessarily require that success be underneath them. Success is just like the danger zone for them. Self-indulgent, selfish, that's not limited to people who are succeeding in different ways. No longer willing to listen, that's not limited to people who are being successful in different ways. Trying to lead from power, that's certainly not. I mean, obviously you have to have power to be that way, but you know people who try to lead by force, by yelling, by simply overpowering other people instead of listening to them. That's a danger for us, even if it's not as dependent on success. And of course, anybody can succumb to a reduced sense of dependence on God when their life is just kind of floating along, even without success. So I want to offer these as a point of reflection as we move into our time after the sermon, and then also as we take the Lord's Supper. And what I want you to do, though, is I want to think back to the parable before this, which is the parable of the Good Samaritan, and remember again the Father. Remember the Father whose arms were open to both children. And here's why. Here's why this is so important. In fact, this is the gospel. The gospel is that God has already reached out to us in Jesus Christ. And when there's a call for reflection, it's not a call to think about things and become acceptable to God. God has already promised the forgiveness for whatever you're going to find upon reflection. Does that make sense? That the forgiveness is already there for whatever you find when you look inside yourself? Because it can be scary to look inside yourself. And it is God's being proactive with His forgiveness that frees us to really look inside ourselves and find the things that need healing so we can really find the peace that God wants for us. And so the first thing is, if you're reflecting on this, you might find that if one of these things makes you a little uncomfortable, that's probably it for you. That's one way to find things that are going on inside of us, is whatever it is we don't want. Whichever one of those you don't really want to read out loud, that might be the one that's going on inside of you that you don't really want to confront. And you need to know right now that God's forgiveness is already there. You don't have to confront it and then wonder about God's forgiveness. It's there for you. Like that Father whose forgiveness is already there. He saw His Son. If you look at one of these things and you say, oh, you know what, I do try to overpower people instead of work with them and talk with them and try to go win-win and figure things out. I do that. Or if you look at this list and say, I have been self-indulgent lately and really I've been using all my stuff just for my own pleasure. You need to think of yourself like the prodigal son who's like walking along and all he knows is he's been a jerk. And it's his dad who sees him and runs out. When you have those thoughts, like, oh, maybe I have been self-indulgent, or maybe I've closed my ears, or maybe I'm getting complacent, as soon as you have those thoughts, the Father runs to you already because you've had the thought. He just loves repentance. He loves people being open to that. That's what the prodigal son is about. The Father loves us and runs to us. And that is where we really find peace. We don't find peace from running away from things. We find peace by opening ourselves up to what's going on inside and then let God remain His mercy on that. So let's take a moment and pray about that, and then we'll take a few minutes for reflection. Father, I'm not sure we still really get this whole parable and how it all works. But we do see a wasteful manager who begins to think again about the future. Whether or not he had whether or not that was dishonest or immoral what he did, the shrewd the owner commended him for at least thinking about the future and thinking about what was going on and taking steps to do something. And so, Father, if any of these dangers, spiritual dangers, confront or live inside any of us, if they're beginning to take a root inside of our soul, if we're living with some smugness or pride, or if complacency is creeping in, or if we find ourselves being self-indulgent and selfish, or if we are closing our ears off and being unwilling to listen to other people or to you, or if we're like, instead of relating to people, we're just trying to overpower them, or if we just really have sort of lost our sense of dependency on you. Lord, show us that right now, even if it hurts. Show us it, but as you do, help us to see the Father of the prodigal son character running towards us, you running towards us with open arms as we discover a place of spiritual danger and sin in our lives that you have forgiven in Jesus. So we ask you to bring us to that point because you love us and you want the best for us. In Jesus' name. So the questions are also in your sermon handout, but they're going to be up here as well. You can just think about it for the next few minutes while you bring the offerings and prayer cards forward. Remember, the prayer cards that you would like to pray for are allowed to put on the altar. And which of these dangers am I most generally susceptible to? But then, number two, do I sense the presence of any of these dangers in my heart right now? And then maybe what do I need to do differently this week? Because we always want to follow James's admonition to be not just hearers of the word, but doers.